Jack always knew he wasn't cut out for suburban life. The neatly trimmed lawns, the cookie-cutter houses, and the endless parade of neighborly smiles hiding passive-aggressive comments. It was all a bit too much for him. But when he bought his modest home in Willow Creek Estates, he thought he'd found his slice of peace. Why? Because his property had something magical. A creek. A babbling, serene stream that wound its way through his backyard, offering the kind of tranquility you couldn't buy with HOA fees or overpriced landscaping. Jack loved that creek. He fished there, watched the birds flutter around it, and even named the occasional frog that hopped by. Gary was a personal favorite. It wasn't just a creek. It was his escape from the monotony of suburban life. But as Jack would soon learn, nothing escapes the iron fist of the homeowners association. The trouble began one sunny afternoon when Jack was enjoying his usual pastime, sitting by the creek with a cold beer and contemplating whether Gary might secretly be plotting world domination. That's when Karen, yes, her name was actually Karen, appeared at the edge of his yard, clipboard in hand and a look on her face that suggested she just smelled something unpleasant. Karen was the president of the HOA, which meant she wielded more power than a suburban dictator and had less tolerance for anything resembling joy. "Jack," she began, her tone dripping with condescension, "we need to talk about your creek." Jack blinked. "My creek? What about it?" Karen sighed as if explaining basic arithmetic to a toddler. "It's a danger to children in the neighborhood. Someone could fall in and hurt themselves." Jack took a sip of his beer and raised an eyebrow. "Karen, it's 2 feet deep. If someone falls in, they'll be wet, not hospitalized." Karen ignored him and launched into a speech about liability issues, community safety, and how the HOA had decided that the creek needed to be drained immediately. Jack tried to argue. He even pointed out that no child had ever been injured near the creek. But Karen wasn't having it. The HOA had spoken, and their word was law. Over the next few weeks, Jack watched helplessly as contractors arrived to drain his beloved creek. They tore up the grass, filled in the streambed with dirt, and left behind what could only be described as a barren wasteland. Gary was nowhere to be found. Jack imagined him hopping away in disgust, muttering something about humans ruining everything. But it wasn't just Jack's peace of mind that suffered. The creek had served as a natural drainage system for rainwater, and without it, things started going wrong, very wrong. The next heavy rain turned Willow Creek Estates into Willow Flood Estates. Lawns were submerged, basements were soaked, and Karen's prized rose garden looked like it had been hit by a tsunami. Jack couldn't help but feel a small flicker of satisfaction as he watched Karen wade through ankle-deep water to retrieve her soggy clipboard. But that satisfaction didn't last long because Karen did what Karens do best. She blamed Jack. "This is your fault," she shrieked during an emergency HOA meeting held in her flooded garage. Jack stared at her in disbelief. "My fault? You're the one who drained the creek." Karen waved her soggy clipboard like it was evidence in a courtroom drama. "If you'd cooperated with us sooner, we could have planned better." Jack decided then and there that he wasn't going to take this lying down. If Karen wanted to play dirty, he'd show her just how muddy things could get. Literally. Over the next few months, Jack became something of an amateur hydrologist. He read up on drainage systems, studied local environmental regulations, and even consulted with an old college buddy who worked in civil engineering. Armed with knowledge and fueled by righteous anger and beer, Jack devised a plan so devious it would make Gary proud. First, he petitioned for permission to restore natural water flow on his property under the guise of environmental conservation. A move Karen couldn't oppose without looking like she hated nature itself. Once approved, Jack hired contractors to dig new channels for rainwater runoff. But instead of directing the water back into its original path through his backyard creek, RIP, he rerouted it toward key areas within Willow Creek Estates, areas like Karen's backyard. The next rainy season arrived with dramatic flair. Thunderclaps echoed across the neighborhood as dark clouds rolled in overhead. Jack sat on his porch with Gary 2.0, a new frog who'd taken up residence, and waited for nature to do its thing. And oh, did it deliver! Karen's backyard transformed into what could only be described as Swamp Central. Her rose garden disappeared beneath murky water teeming with mosquitoes. Her patio furniture floated away like tiny ships lost at sea, and her prized golden retriever refused to step outside without wearing rain boots. Other members of the HOA weren't spared either, especially those who'd voted in favor of draining Jack's Creek. Their pristine lawns became marshlands, their basements turned into indoor swimming pools, and their complaints reached levels so high they could probably be heard from space. Karen tried everything to fix the problem: hiring landscapers, installing pumps, even praying for divine intervention, though rumor had it she only did this after exhausting all other options. But nothing worked because Jack had designed his drainage system to be both legal and hilariously effective. One day, as Karen stood knee-deep in swamp water shouting at yet another contractor who couldn't solve her problem, Jack strolled by with Gary 2.0 perched on his shoulder like some sort of amphibious sidekick. "Nice weather we're having," he said cheerfully. Karen glared at him but said nothing because deep down, even if she'd never admit it, she knew this was karma at its finest. And so Jack reclaimed his peace, not through violence or vandalism but through sheer ingenuity and an unwavering commitment to petty revenge wrapped in environmental activism. As he sat by his newly restored creek, yes, he got permission to rebuild it, sipping beer and watching Gary 2.0 plot world domination again, Jack couldn't help but smile. Sometimes justice isn't served cold. It's served wet and muddy. Jack had always believed that suburban life was a delicate balance between passive-aggressive warfare and outright chaos. But after the HOA drained his beloved creek, that balance tipped sharply into the realm of absurdity. It started with the rain. Not just any rain, the kind of torrential downpour that makes you wonder if Noah might have been onto something with that ark business. At first, Jack thought it was poetic justice. The rain came down in sheets, and without the creek to carry it away, water began pooling in all the wrong places. Karen's backyard, once a pristine showcase of her perfectly symmetrical rose bushes, now resembled a scene from Swamp Thing. Her prized garden gnomes, each one creepier than the last, were half submerged, their painted faces staring blankly out of the muck like tiny ceramic victims of a natural disaster. Jack watched from his porch with a beer in hand and a smirk on his face. Mother Nature, he mused aloud. The original revenge artist. But Karen, being Karen, couldn't let nature take the blame. No, she needed a scapegoat, and who better than Jack? At the next HOA meeting, held in her flooded garage because her living room was now a waiting pool, she wasted no time pointing fingers. "This is your fault, Jack," she declared, slamming her soggy clipboard onto a folding table. The clipboard made a squelching sound that echoed through the room like an accusation. Jack raised an eyebrow. "My fault? Karen, you're the one who drained the creek." Karen's face turned redder than her waterlogged roses. "If you'd cooperated with us sooner, we could have planned for this. Instead you..." She paused dramatically for effect. "Obstructed progress. Obstructed progress?" Jack repeated, incredulous. "Karen, you destroyed an ecosystem because you thought 2 feet of water was going to swallow up neighborhood kids like some kind of suburban Loch Ness monster." The room fell silent except for the occasional drip-drip-drip of water leaking from Karen's garage ceiling. Jack could see that some of his neighbors were trying not to laugh. Even Bob, the HOA treasurer who usually sided with Karen on everything from mailbox colors to acceptable lawn gnome height, looked like he was suppressing a grin. Karen wasn't done yet. "We'll fix this," she announced with the conviction of someone who had no idea what they were talking about. "We'll install new drainage systems, better ones, and we'll make sure everyone contributes to the cost." Jack nearly choked on his beer. "You want me to pay for fixing a problem you caused?" Karen glared at him. "It's called community responsibility." "It's called irony," Jack shot back. The meeting ended in chaos, with Karen storming off and half the neighborhood arguing over whose basement had suffered the most damage. Jack went home feeling both vindicated and deeply annoyed. Sure, watching Karen flounder, literally, was satisfying, but he wasn't about to let her pin this mess on him. That night, as rain continued to pour outside, Jack sat down at his kitchen table with a notebook and a pen. If Karen wanted to play dirty, he'd show her just how muddy things could get. The first step in his plan was research, lots of it. Jack dove into local environmental regulations like a man possessed. He learned about stormwater management systems, zoning laws, and even obscure clauses in HOA bylaws that Karen probably hadn't read since her rise to power, aka when Bob nominated her because no one else wanted the job. Jack also consulted with his old college buddy Mike, who worked as a civil engineer. Mike found the whole situation hilarious and offered plenty of advice. Most of it legal, but all of it petty. "So let me get this straight," Mike said during one late-night phone call. "You want to redirect rainwater back into Karen's yard without breaking any laws?" "Exactly," Jack replied. Mike laughed so hard he nearly dropped the phone. "You're evil. I love it." With Mike's help, Jack devised a plan so cunning it would have made Machiavelli proud. He filed for permission to install what he called an eco-friendly water diversion system on his property. A move that not only complied with local regulations but also earned him praise from environmental groups in the area. Karen couldn't oppose it without looking like she hated both nature and progress, two things she claimed to champion during every HOA election. Begrudgingly, she signed off on the project. Over the next few weeks, contractors arrived at Jack's property to dig trenches and install pipes. To anyone watching, including Karen, it looked like Jack was simply trying to prevent future flooding on his land. But what they didn't know was that those pipes weren't just redirecting water away from Jack's house. They were channeling it straight toward key areas within Willow Creek Estates. Karen's backyard? Check. Bob's meticulously manicured lawn? Double check. Even Linda's koi pond, which everyone secretly hated because she wouldn't shut up about how much it cost, wasn't spared. By the time construction was finished, Jack's property looked like something out of an HGTV special on sustainable living. Rain barrels, gravel pathways for natural runoff absorption, and even a small rain garden filled with native plants. It was all perfectly legal and perfectly diabolical. Then came the next big storm. Jack sat on his porch again as thunder rumbled overhead and rain began to fall in earnest. Within minutes, water started flowing through his new system exactly as planned. Away from his house and toward, well, everywhere else. Karen's backyard flooded first. This time it wasn't just her roses that suffered. Her entire patio disappeared under several inches of water. Bob's lawn turned into a mud pit so deep, he lost 2 pairs of shoes trying to retrieve his garden hose. And Linda, let's just say her koi fish were now enjoying an all-new natural habitat several yards away from their original pond. Jack watched it all unfold with Gary 2.0 perched on his shoulder like some kind of amphibious accomplice. He couldn't help but chuckle as Karen emerged from her house wearing knee-high rubber boots and wielding what appeared to be a pool skimmer. "Looks like your drainage system needs some work," Jack called out cheerfully. Karen didn't respond, mostly because she was too busy trying to rescue one of her gnomes from being swept away by the current. For once in his life, Jack felt truly at peace. Not because he'd won, though he definitely had, but because he'd done it on his terms. Legally, cleverly, and with just enough pettiness to make it unforgettable. And as Gary 2.0 let out what sounded suspiciously like an approving croak, Jack raised his beer in triumph. "Cheers," he said softly, "to nature, to justice, and most importantly, to revenge done right." As the storm raged on and the water continued its relentless march through Willow Creek Estates, Jack sat on his porch like a man watching the climax of a movie he'd written himself. His eco-friendly water diversion system was performing beautifully, not only protecting his property but also delivering poetic justice to every corner of the neighborhood. It was, in Jack's opinion, a masterpiece of suburban engineering. Karen, however, was decidedly less impressed. She stood knee-deep in swamp water in her backyard, wielding a rake like some sort of suburban warrior queen, trying to clear debris from what used to be her prized rose garden. Her gnomes, those creepy little statues she loved so much, were scattered across the yard like casualties of war. One particularly unfortunate gnome had lost its head and was now floating face down near the patio steps. Jack couldn't resist. He leaned over the porch railing and called out, "Hey Karen, looks like you've got yourself a nice little wetland back there. Ever think about applying for a conservation grant?" Karen shot him a glare so fiery it could have evaporated the swamp water if only she'd been capable of harnessing her rage into actual heat energy. "This is your fault," she shouted, pointing the rake at him like it was some kind of accusatory weapon. Jack raised an eyebrow and took a leisurely sip of his beer. My fault? Karen, I think you'll find this is what we call natural consequences. You know, like when you drain a creek without thinking about where the water might go. Karen stomped or tried to stomp. It's hard to stomp effectively when your boots are submerged in mud, and stormed back into her house, slamming the door behind her. Jack could hear muffled yelling from inside, probably directed at her husband, Todd, who had long since perfected the art of nodding silently while Karen ranted. But Karen wasn't the only one suffering. Across the street, Bob was standing in what used to be his meticulously manicured front lawn, staring at the muddy mess with an expression that suggested he'd just lost a beloved family member. Bob's lawn was his pride and joy, the kind of grass that looked like it had been photoshopped into reality, and now it was nothing more than a soggy disaster zone. Jack, Bob called out, waving his arms dramatically. What's going on? My lawn looks like it's been hit by a hurricane. Jack shrugged innocently. Looks like you've got some drainage issues, Bob. Bob's face turned redder than Karen's roses used to be. Drainage issues? This is a catastrophe. Do you know how much I spend on landscaping every year? Jack pretended to think about it for a moment before replying, I don't know, Bob. Maybe you should have spent some of that money on flood insurance. Bob opened his mouth to respond but closed it again when he realized he didn't actually have a comeback for that. Instead, he stomped off toward his house, a much more effective stomp than Karen's earlier attempt, and disappeared inside. Linda wasn't faring much better. Her koi pond, which she never stopped bragging about, had overflowed entirely, sending her precious fish on an impromptu adventure through the neighborhood. Linda was running around with a net, trying desperately to catch them before they ended up in someone else's flooded yard. Jack, she shouted as she passed by his property, holding up an empty bucket for emphasis. Do you have any idea how much those koi cost? Jack leaned back in his chair and smiled lazily. Nope, he said cheerfully, but I bet they're enjoying their new habitat. Linda huffed and continued chasing after her fish while muttering something about lawsuits under her breath. By now, Jack's reputation as the unofficial villain of Willow Creek Estates was firmly established, but Jack didn't mind one bit. After all, he hadn't broken any laws. Everything he'd done was perfectly legal and meticulously planned. If anything, he considered himself more of an antihero, a Robin Hood of rainwater redistribution. Still, Jack knew that Karen wouldn't let this go without a fight. Sure enough, just days after the storm subsided, Karen called for another emergency HOA meeting. This time held at Linda's house because Karen's garage was still too flooded to host anything other than aquatic life. Jack arrived at the meeting early and took a seat near the back of Linda's living room, which smelled faintly of wet carpet. He watched as Karen paced back and forth at the front of the room like a general preparing her troops for battle. This situation is unacceptable, Karen declared dramatically, slapping her soggy clipboard onto Linda's coffee table for emphasis. Our neighborhood is being destroyed by flooding, and it's all because of Jack. Everyone turned to look at Jack, who waved cheerfully and said, Hi everyone. Karen ignored him and continued her tirade. We need to take action. We need to hold Jack accountable for this mess. Jack raised his hand politely. Excuse me, he said when Karen reluctantly acknowledged him with an eye roll. Can I ask exactly how you plan to hold me accountable for something that's entirely your fault? Karen sputtered incoherently for a moment before regaining her composure. You installed that drainage system. You redirected all the water into our properties. Jack nodded slowly. That's true, but I did it legally and with full approval from the HOA. He gestured toward Karen's clipboard. You signed off on it yourself. Karen looked like she'd just swallowed something unpleasant. A frog, perhaps. Gary 2.0 would have been proud. The rest of the room murmured quietly as they realized Jack had them cornered. And let me remind everyone, Jack continued with mock seriousness, that this all started because Karen decided my creek was a danger to children. If anyone here wants to blame someone for our current situation, he paused dramatically before pointing directly at Karen. Blame her. The room erupted into chaos as neighbors began arguing among themselves about who was really at fault, and more importantly, who should pay for fixing everything. Karen tried desperately to regain control, but quickly realized she'd lost whatever authority she once had over Willow Creek Estates. Meanwhile, Jack sat back in his chair with Gary 2.0 perched on his shoulder, figuratively speaking, and enjoyed every second of watching karma unfold. By the end of the meeting, which ended without any resolution whatsoever, Jack walked out feeling victorious yet again. Because if there was one thing Jack had learned from this whole ordeal, it was that revenge is best served wet, and hilariously inconvenient for everyone involved except you. Jack woke up the morning after the HOA meeting feeling like a man who'd just won an Olympic gold medal in petty revenge. Sure, he didn't have a medal to show for it yet, but the satisfaction of watching Karen's reign of suburban terror crumble under the weight of her own incompetence was worth more than any shiny piece of hardware. He brewed himself a fresh pot of coffee, stepped out onto his porch, and surveyed his kingdom. A backyard creek restored to its former glory, a neighborhood still soggy from the storm, and a community in complete disarray. It was beautiful. Karen, however, wasn't ready to surrender. Jack knew this because she showed up at his doorstep later that afternoon with her clipboard in hand and Todd trailing behind her like an obedient golden retriever. Todd looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, perhaps scuba diving in their flooded garage, but Karen marched forward with the determination of someone who hadn't yet realized they were fighting a losing battle. "Jack," she said, her tone sharp enough to cut through steel. "We need to talk." Jack leaned against the doorframe and took a sip of his coffee. "Oh, I've been looking forward to this." Karen ignored his sarcasm and launched into what sounded like a rehearsed speech. "The flooding in our neighborhood is unacceptable. As a member of this community, you have a responsibility to help fix it." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Karen, I think we've already established that the flooding is your fault." Karen's face turned red, partly from anger and partly from embarrassment, but she pressed on. "Regardless of who's at fault, we need to work together to solve this problem." Jack pretended to think about it for a moment before replying. "You know what? You're absolutely right. We do need to work together." He paused dramatically before adding, "So how about you start by restoring my creek?" Karen blinked at him like he'd just suggested she donate her entire rose garden to charity. "Restore your creek? Are you insane?" "No," Jack said cheerfully. "I'm just practical. The creek was a natural drainage system that kept this neighborhood dry for decades. You drained it because you thought it was dangerous, which, by the way, was ridiculous, and now look what's happened." Todd nodded silently behind Karen, clearly agreeing with Jack, but too afraid to say so out loud. Karen sputtered incoherently for a moment before regaining her composure. "Restoring the creek would be expensive. Who's going to pay for it?" Jack smiled innocently. "Oh, I think we can find room in the HOA budget. After all, you spent plenty of money draining it in the first place." Karen looked like she wanted to argue but couldn't come up with anything coherent. Finally, she turned on her heel and stormed off down the driveway with Todd trailing behind her like a man resigned to his fate. Jack watched them go and chuckled softly to himself. He wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. Over the next few weeks, Jack launched what could only be described as a grassroots campaign for creek restoration. He started by talking to his neighbors, many of whom were still furious at Karen for flooding their properties, and convincing them that restoring the creek was the best solution for preventing future disasters. "Think about it," he told Bob one afternoon while standing in Bob's muddy front yard. "Your lawn used to be perfect before Karen drained my creek. Restore the creek, and your grass will be green again." Bob nodded thoughtfully. "You know what? You're right. I miss my lawn." Jack moved on to Linda next. "Your koi pond overflowed because there was nowhere for the rainwater to go," he explained patiently while Linda tried, and failed, to net one of her escaped fish from a neighbor's yard. "Restore the creek, and your koi will stay where they belong." Linda sighed dramatically but agreed. Even Karen's most loyal supporters began turning against her as Jack pointed out how much money they'd spent repairing flood damage. Money that could have been saved if the creek had been left alone. Eventually, Jack gathered enough support to call for another HOA meeting. this time held at his house because everyone agreed it was the only property in Willow Creek Estates that wasn't underwater. Karen arrived late and looked visibly annoyed as she took her seat at Jack's dining room table. She tried to regain control of the situation by launching into yet another speech about community responsibility. But Jack cut her off before she could get too far. "Let's keep this simple," he said firmly. "The flooding is out of control because you drained my creek without thinking about the consequences. The solution is obvious. Restore the creek." The room erupted into murmurs as neighbors nodded in agreement. Karen tried desperately to argue but quickly realized she was outnumbered and outmatched. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of awkward silence, Karen sighed heavily and said, "Fine, we'll restore the creek." Jack grinned triumphantly as cheers erupted around the room. Over the next few months, contractors arrived once again, this time to undo Karen's disastrous decision and bring Jack's beloved creek back to life. When the work was finally finished, Jack stood by his restored stream with Gary 2.0 perched on his shoulder, figuratively speaking, and marveled at how perfect everything looked. The neighborhood slowly returned to normal, or as normal as suburban life could ever be, and Jack found himself enjoying his peaceful backyard once again. As for Karen, well, let's just say her reign as HOA president ended shortly after the creek restoration project was completed. She resigned under pressure from angry neighbors and retreated into obscurity, a fitting end for someone who thought draining a creek would make her a hero. And so Jack lived happily ever after, or at least until Karen inevitably found something else ridiculous to complain about. But if there's one thing Jack learned from this entire ordeal, it's that sometimes revenge isn't just sweet, it's downright refreshing. Now, if you enjoyed this story as much as I enjoyed telling it, don't forget to like, share, comment below with your favorite part, and subscribe for more tales of suburban chaos and petty revenge. Thanks for listening.